Welcome to Playlists Through a UDL Lens. There are a lot of connections between blended learning practices and the universal design for learning thoughts and practices. So today we are focusing on playlists. When I think about the universal design for learning guidelines, playlists and the concept behind playlists shows up in multiple places. Primarily, I look at that engagement principle, this first column of the UDL guidelines, and I see the idea behind playlists surfacing in lots of different ways. The first place that I see it surfacing is really when you think about that idea of optimizing individual choice and autonomy, especially that idea of giving your students power over their own learning experience and empowering them to make choices that are meaningful for them. Those are the concepts behind playlists, where you're giving your students that understanding of the process and giving them the power to move through the process at a pace that is appropriate for them. I also see it surfacing in this first concept of minimize threats and distractions. Part of the thinking there is that for a lot of students, not knowing what's going to be happening in their day and feeling kind of powerless in understanding what's coming next and where things are going and having no understanding of the scope and sequence, that can be anxiety inducing. So the idea of playlists where students can clearly see the entire pathway that they are going to be plotting and kind of what's expected of them and what they can expect, that really helps to minimize some of those threats for students because they understand the steps of the process. I also see it surfacing within this engagement category when I think about this idea of promoting expectations and beliefs that optimize motivation. Part of this whole motivation idea with playlists is that kids kind of have this concept of, okay, here's how far I've come and here's what I still have to do. And having that sense of an ending point can be really, really motivating for students to keep going and to keep working through the process because they kind of understand the whole big picture. Now, I do see some connections with the UDL guidelines and some of the other pieces when you think of the representation column. We'll talk about that momentarily. But the other place I really want to highlight on this UDL guidelines where I see a direct connection between the universal design for learning concepts and the concepts behind playlists is really in this last column in this portion of executive functioning. With executive functioning, really it's about this appropriate goal setting and the support and planning, strategy development. And that's really the foundational skills that you are building when you are empowering your students to kind of start those processes when you support it through the use of a playlist, because that playlist really does then help your students to begin and see how that process is modeled. So really, when you think about the whole idea behind playlists, there's a lot of connections between those blended learning practices and the UDL guideline. All right, so now that we've made some explicit connections between the concepts behind playlists and the concepts behind the UDL guidelines and some of those mindsets, let's talk about how would you go about designing a playlist with UDL in mind? Well, let's start with the construction of the playlist itself, the format in which you are sharing it with your students. With anything, there are considerations, positives, and maybe potential drawbacks for either modality in which you would share. So primarily, I have seen playlists shared in a print or a digital format. The positives of a print format is that it can be a very tangible place for students. They actually have it physically in front of them. They're able to annotate and cross things off. And that can be really, really beneficial, especially when perhaps some of the content that they're engaging with on that playlist happens to be in a digital format. So it helps with that cognitive load of managing lots of different things. When I think about the positives of a digital format, it's that idea that there's extra scaffolds and supports that can be built in. For example, if my students would either need or would benefit from hearing the text of that playlist read aloud to them, a digital format actually aids in helps with that automatically because they have access to some of those automatic screen reader kinds of pieces. Now, you can also think about the ability within that digital format of being able to do things like hyperlinking to add in scaffolds and supports. That then brings me to this idea of the content itself in your playlist. When we think about the fundamental pieces behind the UDL guidelines being multiple means, multiple modalities, multiple pathways, when we consider the content that we're asking our students to engage with as part of their playlist experience, one of the things that I would consider you to think about from that UDL lens is what modalities are they actually encountering when they gain their knowledge through the playlist. So whether the playlist itself is shared in a physical form or in a digital form, I would encourage you to think about the modalities of, are there text pieces that you're asking students to interact with? Are there video? Are there audio? And how to use those in a way that really, really supports students in the way that they learn best. There's nothing wrong with having students interact with text, but as I mentioned before, there's always considerations. So if students are constantly being asked to interact with the text, perhaps that is not the way that they consume information best. So considering adding in video might be empowering to the students that you have in front of you. So that brings me to the last piece that I would really, really encourage you to consider when you're constructing playlists from that UDL lens would be that idea of how can you minimize maybe some of the barriers or the potential pitfalls that students could encounter with a playlist. Things like adding in videos, for example, to scaffold not only the instruction, but also thinking about that content, the power of being able to hear things and interact with things in multiple ways, not just in the very text-based formats that typically playlists involve. I also think about what kinds of structural pieces could you add in, like even little think abouts to your playlist to help encourage students to go deeper or to kind of be mindful of certain things, because oftentimes they are autonomous when they're interacting with these playlists. And so that there may be questions that arise or things that you really want students to focus in on. So adding those scaffolds and supports automatically into the playlist can be really, really, really empowering. Ultimately, the goal of a playlist is to personalize that learning experience for students. And when we think about that ability to build that autonomy as a student to choose your pace, especially, and your path, and the times which you are encountering your learning experiences, when you design with the UDL lens, you are being empathetic to your end users, and you're trying to design with empathy to remove as many barriers for that playlist experience for your students as possible.